Up to this point, we've worked with pivot tables that only had one value or metric. You could definitely have more than one metric or value field in a pivot table, and in this lesson, we're going to see how to do that. Let's start off by looking at the Finished Property Pricing tab again. This tab shows a breakdown of our property by bedrooms, then bathrooms. So I can double click on number of bedrooms and expand the number of bathrooms. But for the values, we're showing three. We're showing the minimum price, the average price, and the maximum price. This is an example of multiple data points in a pivot table. We'll do that by building this pivot table from scratch. Let's go over to the Data List of Homes tab. We're going to use that. And we'll go ahead and insert our pivot table. So we'll go to Tables and Summarize with Pivot Table. And detected we want to use the Realty database. And we're going to go to put the pivot table on a new worksheet and click OK. Now let's go ahead and rename this new worksheet. We'll just call this Working Property Pricing. Now we'll just do some of the basic setup first. Let's go ahead and get the number of bedrooms as a row header. And then underneath that we'll have the number of bathrooms. And we want to have state and city as report headers. And we're building our pivot table out. Well, now what we want to do is we want to have our first value. So let's go ahead and we're going to start off just with the basic metric and put price in there. Now remember, this time we wanted the minimum, average, and maximum price. So let's take our field and expand the field selections. Instead of the sum of price, let's get the minimum. And instead of calling it min of price, let's just call it minimum price. That'll be a little bit more straightforward. And click OK. Now we have the minimum price. Maybe we'll format that as currency as well. Now the next metric we want is going to be the average price. And so for that, what we're going to do is we're going to go back up to our field names and we'll click and drag price again and drop that in the values section. So we're dragging the same fact or field down, but we're going to create a different metric or measure. So this time when I go into my field settings, I'm going to make that the average, and I'll just call it average price. Make sure I formatted that as currency as well. And we'll do that one more time to make the maximum price. And now we have a pivot table that has number of bedrooms and bathrooms. I can go ahead and modify those labels too. We have number of bedrooms and bathrooms, and we have three metrics for each one. So the subtotal of all houses with 2 bedrooms, the minimum is 69,000, the average is 94, and the max is 122. And then you see inside each of the values, you see the minimum is indeed 69,729. Now notice something else in our pivot table builder that happened. We've got all the values still here in the value section, the minimum, the average, and the max. But something else happened once we got more than one value down here. We got this extra tab here in the column labels called values. Whenever you have multiple data points in your pivot table, you have to tell Excel how to line it up. Do you want to line it up across columns, or do you want it to be rows? Let's just drag the values over to rows to see what it does. And then we have the same thing, except it looks different. Now we have 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, minimum, average, and max price. 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, minimum, average, and max price. Still the same information, but this time you're looking at the data in a different way. And herein lies the proficiency in using multiple data points. You have to figure out the best way to display and configure your information. Now most pivot tables you build are only going to use one metric with a different row and column attributes. But pivot tables that contain multiple data points or value fields can be useful, but they can take a little more thought up front to display good information without making the table too confusing to look at. The most important aspect of any pivot table is determining up front what it is you're trying to communicate.